All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, August 16th of 2021. I hope you guys all had an awesome weekend. Thank you, everybody that is tuning in here live or watching this or listening back as a recording. I know some folks have mentioned that they've been listening to this show here in the car going to or from work, so that is awesome. Welcome, everybody. Again, I hope it was a great weekend for everybody. Maybe take down a couple DFS contests. If this is your first time watching our show, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. You guys kind of guide the conversation here. I host the show live for a reason. I want feedback from you guys. I want follow-up questions. I want engagement from you guys. If you have something to add, please feel free to pop it into either YouTube chat or in our Office Hours channel on Slack. I try to keep a pretty close eye on both of those chat channels, make sure I'm seeing questions, especially if they relate to what we're talking to as they come in and things like that. James is here. James, what's up, man? He said, hope you had a nice weekend. I did. It was great. I hope your weekend was good too. I was enjoying the nice weather here in Denver. Had a couple beers on a brewery patio this weekend, so it was good. But we finally the air quality here has been terrible with all the wildfires going on recently, so it's finally starting to clear up, which is good. I hope that means that the wildfires are getting a little better further out west. So got to spend a little time outside this weekend, but excited to get back into it. We've got a 10-game baseball slate, I think, here tonight, so should be fun. A few questions in the queue, not too bad, but if you've got some questions you want me to answer, you've got something that you want to talk about, go ahead and get them into the queue now here. So I see the questions coming. I know what's on the plate for today, but I'm going to go ahead and pull up the app here. We've got that pulled up and just start getting into this. So we had a good question come in. I think it was actually Friday afternoon here from Schmeiler. I think it's pronounced that way. Let me know if it isn't, but there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to go ahead and kind of pick up I'm going to kind of pick out some of these questions here. But I guess kind of this starts on I guess questions about smaller field contests and things like that, how it might differ from cash or not, depending on field size or type. Things like multipliers. Do you employ more of a cash strategy? Does it depend? Yeah, I think this is a good question. So I'm going to kind of talk about this from two fronts. Some small field type strategy and some multiplier type strategy. I know there was a question in Slack recently or a couple weeks ago here where Max actually chimed in and just emphasized overall that it's very important to look at the payout structure of these contests, who gets paid and how much when determining what the optimal strategy is. And in the case of multipliers, I guess I'll probably start there. I think it's interesting, and I think there's a couple different ways to tackle this. I think so. When we're talking about a multiplier, we're talking about contests that are, I guess, double ups in some ways fit into that category, but a certain portion of the field gets a flat multiplier payout when they win, right? So we're talking about in some ways double ups. I think those are treated as traditionally more like cash games, but triple ups, right? Roughly a third of the field tripling their money. Quintuple ups, roughly a fifth of the field, 5xing their money. And then we start to get into some interesting contests like I know DraftKings has 10x boosters and 40x boosters, right? And it's difficult sometimes to know exactly what the optimal strategy here is because they don't necessarily fit into other contest types, right? We do have slider settings here for multipliers if you haven't seen these before. And what they're basically just going to tell you to do is use your cash lineup. And I do think this does make a lot of sense up to, at the very least, triple ups, right? In a double up contest, we're basically trying to make a 56th, including the rake, 56th-ish percentile lineup, which is why we want just the optimal mean projected lineup, which is what these kinds of settings are going to do. I think the difference between this and a triple up lineup, I think it's difficult to isolate out what makes a difference between a really good cash lineup and a really good triple up lineup, which I think is why you see, and I think the typical conventional wisdom is to just play your cash lineup in triple ups. I don't play a lot of cash. I don't play a lot of triple ups, but when I did and when I have in the past, I used my cash lineups in triple up lineups because I don't think there was a lot of differentiation, I think, between what a lineup that succeeds in a double up and a triple up is. I think you could justify doing a little bit of light stacking here, or a little bit of light correlation in a triple up contest, but I don't think that is what the conventional wisdom would lead you to believe about these. But when you start to get to contests like quintuple ups, and you're talking about a contest where only a fifth of the field is getting paid out, I do think it does make some sense to start including some light GPP type factors into your builds. I would say, I'm trying to think if there's a good slider setting that would kind of mimic the effects of that. I could see playing quintuple ups and getting two sliders that start to look something kind of similar to this, where we want to start taking into impact the effects of correlation, right? We want to start having stacks in our lineup because we're trying to come up with a top 20th percentile lineup overall. I don't know, depending on the contest size, it may make some sense to include some light ownership fade. And I think it also makes sense for us to start including some smart diversity, right? Quintuple ups are right on that edge where I find it really hard. That's another contest that doesn't really make it into my overall contest selection strategy. I still don't think the upside of playing those contests over a long period of time is really there for me. But it's right on that edge. I would say once you get to the point of playing things like the 10x and 40x boosters, which I do play, I do like those contests quite a bit. I'm approaching those contests with a full GPP mindset. In fact, I'm just typically using lineups that appear in my GPP contests in those 40x and 10x boosters, right? And the way of just thinking about this is what percentage of the field is getting paid out, and how much are you getting for a payout, right? A 40x booster is not going to mimic the totally top-heavy contest structure of a typical GPP, but it is still a very small percentage of the field that's getting paid out, and I think it makes sense to think about those contests with GPP ideas in mind, correlation, upside, that kind of thing. So I would say, I guess, kind of breaking things down, double ups, triple ups, I think based on how much of the field is getting paid out, what you stand to gain by looking for upside, very little, right? I think it probably makes sense to approach that with a very cash type mindset. On the high end, 40x and 10x boosters, I think when you look at, again, how much of the field is getting paid out, what do you stand to gain when you cash? It makes sense to think about that from a very GPP-focused mindset, building lineups built for upside. And then those quintuple ups are kind of right in the middle where I think it makes sense. Probably, if you're going to, I think in my mind, they are probably best thought of as a very, very, like, a completely flat GPP structure, right? Where I think it probably makes sense to use some ideas of correlation, some upside, but you're not trying to really come in first, really, right? You just want that top 80th percentile outcome. So good question overall. I would say from a contest selection standpoint, if you are successful as a cash game player, I think you can justify working some triple ups into your contests, but I'm not a huge fan of cash games. I think the edge on those are very small. I don't play a lot of cash games. If you are already focused heavily on playing GPPs, I think the 10x and 40x boosters can be an interesting thing to add to your contest selection portfolio, especially if you want to get more action at the low stakes. I know there's boosters at quarter and dollar contests that I like to play quite a bit, and I approach those with a full GPP mindset. So very, very good question there. I think on the smaller field side, I think that question is a little bit easier to just answer from the perspective of our sliders, right? I've mentioned before that these sliders are not educated guesses. They are back-tested and data-driven by building thousands of lineups at each slider setting and then comparing them to how the expected value of those thousands of lineups performs in contests that actually ran at different entry limits and entrants and styles and things like that. So if you are tackling single entry contests that are between 101 and 1,000 people, like we have pulled up on the screen here, these sliders of correlation 8, 0, and 2, for example, are what our backtesting tells us is kind of the optimal way to play. Not only are those useful from like this standpoint of just getting your build done and getting some sliders, some lineups built, but I also think this is a very useful for kind of applying our own process or our own approach to the slate, right? We can kind of make a general assumption here that we don't really even need to consider ownership in a contest of this size is something that we need to get away from. Using a really basically a very strong set of projections that are determined by real ranges of outcomes, or that are determined by game simulations and therefore incorporate players' real ranges of outcomes, and giving ourselves a little bit of an opportunity via smart diversity to take care of some upside, we build lineups that have high win equity for these kinds of contests. So I would say on the small entry stuff, use the sliders as an opportunity to guide you overall, because they are well optimized for those kinds of contests. The multiplier sliders, I think, maybe actually could probably just use a little bit of work, because I don't think this is telling the full story. I think using cash game sliders, which is essentially what this is doing, is fine for your triple ups and things like that. But once you reach the quintuple ups and definitely the boosters and contests and things like that, I don't think these are going to build lineups that are well equipped to win those kinds of contests. So thank you for asking this question. I'm glad I had an opportunity to mention that, because this is one of those cases where I would say I would go a different direction from maybe what the builder is just telling you right out of the gate. So, but Schmeiler, I know you said that you are a commuter listener here. So whenever you get to this, let me know if that was helpful. I know you had some NFL questions here as well. So as we get a little bit closer, we'll start working in a little bit more NFL conversation to these videos here. The team is working hard on getting the NFL sims in a really good spot, making sure that we're ready for the season. So I've been holding off a little bit on starting to answer some of the NFL type questions, especially when it talks about strategy, because I just want to make sure that all of our sims are dialed in and we're ready, and that what I am pulling up on screen looks like projections. That makes sense. I know there's a couple players that are missing and things like that. So we will be talking about football increasingly here as we move forward. But anyway, I'm going to keep us rolling here, get us going to the next question. I see a bunch of conversation here going on in YouTube chat here. So I'll go ahead and get caught up with these in a bit. But for now, I'm going to just go ahead and hit some of these other questions that are in the Slack channel here. So good question from Fisty here came in. And he asked this yesterday evening, said, do you ever look at cumulative ownership? So I think that cumulative ownership is a bit of a I don't know what the right word is. I think it has found a place in the DFS industry and the DFS world as a attempt to quantify how owned a lineup is going to be, right? But it doesn't actually do a very good job of that. The idea, let's say we were playing a contest where you're using 3 players, right? And the odds of a lineup where you have a 28% owned player and a 1% owned player and a 1% owned player, the odds of that lineup being duplicated in the contest, or even that any subset of pairing of any 2 players in that lineup being paired together, is much lower than a lineup that is 3 players that are 10% and 10% and 10% owned, right? And those 2 lineups would have the same cumulative ownership, right? This calculation doesn't actually do a very good job of quantifying how likely a lineup or a set of players is likely to be used together. So I know Will replied to this and said, hashtag geometric mean gang. I think using an average ownership also is a better approach, and is also very similar to what actually my preferred approach is here. And I like to use the ownership product. The ownership product of your lineup would be all the ownership projections multiplied. Well, really the real ownership product would be all the ownership values, but the ownership projections all multiplied together. And what I have always liked to do is actually to compare that against the total number of entries in the contest. So when you take the ownership product of a lineup and then multiply it by the number of entries in the contest, you have a very rough calculation of how many lineups you might expect to be in that contest with that exact lineup. It's a very interesting approach as a very quick way to determine what your chances of being duplicated are, but also kind of provides a more concrete value or a basis of comparison for comparing what lineups are more leveraged against the field than others, right? Because it relates to something that is concrete. It explains something. That calculation has a purpose. So I think I know, Fisty, you've sent me a few of your screenshots here of your spreadsheet and some of the things that you're doing behind the scenes. So I think if you're looking to add something there as a basis of comparing lineups from an ownership standpoint, I think you will find much more success using an ownership product to quantify that. And also, I'd recommend multiplying that against the number of entries in your contest and using that as a bit of a way of quantifying how likely your lineup is to be duplicated, or how many entries you might expect in the contest with that exact same lineup. In sports like MMA or certain NFL showdowns, or occasionally PGA, I've experimented with using a calculation like that before, just to make sure that I'm playing lineups that at the bare minimum have an ownership product of 1 or less than 1, so that I feel somewhat confident that that lineup won't be duplicated. But I do think it's an interesting idea. And I don't know, really, to be completely honest, why ownership sum has become such a ubiquitous idea in the DFS world, because it does very little. And I know we've had some requests before from people asking if on step 3 we could put in a total lineup ownership or something like that. And we want to give you guys some more tools to compare the ownership of lineups against each other in step 3. But we're looking for some creative ways to do that, because, again, I think people have gotten used to seeing that, but it really doesn't actually do very much. And it doesn't even work very well as a basis of comparing the likelihood of a lineup being duplicated, or comparing what lineups are more leveraged against the field than another, because an ownership sum just tells you very little. Again, that calculation just doesn't mean very much. And at least with an ownership product, we can say that this calculation is doing something. So, but really good question. I'm going to keep us moving along. Fisty, don't know if you're watching here with me today, but let me know if you have any other follow-up questions with that whenever you get a chance to watch this. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to a question here from Mark. This is another good one. And Mark said, still playing with the run totals to get different projections. Haven't found anything I like yet. Might stop trying to adjust them and go a different route. Yeah, so this is a good point here. I'm going to actually go ahead and pull up our YouTube channel for just a second to show off a video that I think is kind of useful to at least mention here. Let me go ahead and get this pulled up here. Every single time I pull up our YouTube channel, there are more subscribers to it. So that's awesome. Thank you, everybody that has subscribed to our YouTube channel. But let me go ahead and pull this up here real quick. And okay, so I've got our YouTube channel. Oh, so now I've got our YouTube channel pulled up. And we did a strategy session here now a month ago with Max and Andy, the 5 ways to build winning DFS lineups. And the big theme of this video, the point of this, was to try to show that there are a lot of different tools within SaberSim that you can use to create your process and figure out the way you want to approach slates. And there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way, or a right or a wrong combination of these things, right? So, I mean, I don't do a lot of my work here. A lot of my time and my process isn't spent on editing projections, because it's never been a way that like really resonates strongly with my approach. A lot of my time is spent dialing in my exposures, figuring out how over or under the field I want to be on certain players based on what I'm seeing on the slate, who I think is going to be owned and who's going to carry ownership. But editing projections has never been really what has felt intuitive to me. So I think if you are experimenting with that and it just doesn't feel like that's the right approach, it is totally fine to try to change something up. I think you can add a lot of value editing your exposures. You can play an ownership game and add a lot of your value editing ownership. Ownership is something that is a lot more intuitive to me. It's easier for me to look at a big 10-game slate like tonight. And even if I don't have a good read on how I want to tweak projections, I might have a very good read on how I think the field is actually going to play the slate. That's another place where I add a lot of my value. So nothing wrong with figuring out what process works for you, especially once you get familiar with the tool and figuring that out. I would say too, the one like misconception that I hear sometimes that I definitely at least want to just mention here is that you don't necessarily, if you are going to edit projections, and especially if you're going to edit team projections, you don't necessarily need to try to predict the future here. And I don't necessarily need to think. I don't necessarily think that you need to come at this from the standpoint of trying to just nail the exact projections as accurately as possible. You can use the projections in some way as a tool to actually get your leverage on the slate and basically make the stand that instead of saying, I think this team is going to have this performance, you can come at it from the standpoint that when this performance happens, I am going to maximize my profit in the contests, for example. So let's just say that you, I don't know, that maybe your approach was leading to you to thinking that I don't even know. Let's just find a good example. Let's say Tukey is going to be pretty highly owned, right? It looks like he's probably going to be the cheap pitching option for most players tonight. You can come at this from the standpoint of saying that I'm going to bump up Miami's projection, right? And again, you'd want to run some builds and experiment with this and figure out exactly what makes sense. Not so much as a prediction that I'm saying, I think Tukey's going to have a bad night, or I think that the Marlins are going to have a very good night, but maybe as a statement of saying, I'm finding leverage on this slate by playing more players against the chalkiest value pitcher on the slate. And by increasing this team's projection, I am maximizing my chances of my lineup succeeding when that outcome takes place, right? I think that outcome is more likelier to take place than the field is going to be to roster that team. And I'm going to maximize the profitability of my lineups when that outcome takes place. But I do feel like I hear people get kind of in their heads of overly trying to make sure that this exactly mimics like an accurate, a hyper accurate view of the slate, or people that go in here and update all of these to Vegas, right? That's not really moving you in a direction that's getting you leverage on the field. And you can approach projections that way. Does it make sense to go in and take every team that's up against one of the top pitchers on the slate and bump all these teams up so that you're getting these super leveraged lineups? Probably not, right? Unless maybe you're playing like the $5 contest on DraftKings tonight, which is super top heavy, and you're going to need a lot to win. But you can approach projection editing from that standpoint and feel comfortable doing that, right? So I did just want to mention that. I don't know if that's confusing. If anyone has any questions there, or if I managed to just kind of confuse anybody by saying that, let me know, because I think it's a little bit of an interesting point, or maybe not exactly what is kind of conventional here. But it's something I've actually been trying to work into my process a little bit more. But rather than thinking about, because projections are not predictions, right? That's an important thing to remember, right? They represent a range of outcomes. And you can think about your editing projections as a way to capitalize on a certain range of outcomes occurring, rather than trying to make an accurate prediction about the slate, especially in a sport like baseball. That's hypervariant, that has wide ranges of outcomes. So I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to keep it rolling. Mark, again, I don't know if you're here with me today. Give me a heads up if you are. Give me a wave or something like that. But whenever you get a chance to come watch this back, let me know if you have any more questions there. Again, kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there because I've got a little bit of time to talk about some of this stuff today with a little bit of a light queue on questions. So, but long story short here, if you've been struggling with editing the run totals, or doesn't really feel like that's an intuitive part of your process, or isn't really making a lot of sense, feel free to try something different, right? Try to get more of your leverage and try to put more of your imprint on the slate in editing exposures or editing ownership, or try some different things like that. So, yeah. But anyway, okay, cool. Question from Ryan here on Slack that also came in, it looks like yesterday. And he said, struggling to understand if/when to have just one rule in place for only 4-man stacks, of the team I deem necessary, and adding when/if to add a second 3 or 4-man stack rule of some of the same teams or those I just rank lower. This is FanDuel specific. Thanks. I don't think that you need to get too in the weeds on FanDuel with manual stacking rules. I think it is totally fine to set a stacking rule to say that you need a 4-stack in every lineup. That basically is just going to maximize that, or it's going to force and make sure that you have at least one lineup with, what's going on here, with a 4-stack of every team, right? But the builders from there should give you a good mix of 4-4, 4-3, maybe some 4-2s, maybe 4-1-1-1s with your remaining slots in your lineup in a way that I think also takes into account ownership fade and upside. That should probably be sufficient. I think by setting an additional manual stacking rule, I think if you set a manual stacking rule that said like at least use always a 4-2, I think you're basically just going to do what the builder wanted you to do anyway. I don't think we're going to see many 4-1-1-1s here show up. And beyond that, I think you are forcing, well, this is kind of weird. I haven't seen this before. Maybe something going on there. I'll see what's going on. I think that's probably just a visual bug because it looks like it is building successfully, but that's kind of weird. I think by setting like a 4-4 mandatory stacking rule, you are locking yourself out of lineup constructions that have win equity for the contest, that don't really need to be, that you don't really need to emphasize, right? This is kind of tripping me out here. I'm going to just let this stop and we'll just look at our stack types of the lineups that we built. But you can see here, even for a 20 max, we're already getting so many of these kinds of lineups. Let's even expand to like just look at the first 300, right? We're getting almost the exact kinds of lineups that we want here anyway with this 4 stack. I don't think you need to go in here and say that there needs to be an additional 2 rule or an additional 3 rule or a 4 rule even. I would probably just let the builder do what it wants and set your initial 4 stack rule. So I want to review this question one time really quick and just make sure. So yeah, I mean, I think Ryan, I wouldn't feel like you need to go overboard with the rules here, right? The whole point of creating of simulating the games play by play to determine these correlations dynamically is to avoid you having to stress out about these things. I don't even think you necessarily need to have the 4 stack rule in here. I think you're going to get a lot of the lineups that look the way you want anyway. But if you want to put a 4 stack in to make sure that that's in place, I think that is plenty. I would not stress about adding secondary stack rules or anything like that, because the builder is going to handle building most of these lineups the way that you need to, and the kinds of lineups you're looking for, right? So I see a couple questions came in here related to this. So I'm going to stay on the subject. Aaron said, how do you feel about using 5-man stacks in smaller field contests? I think that probably says, I know you like the 4-mans. Yeah, I experiment with some of the 5-mans too on bigger slates, like a 10-game slate like tonight, especially, or some of those like 15, 14, 13-game slates. I think it makes sense to maximize the correlation of your lineups. You nailed it here, because again, yes, you don't need to be super optimal. You often don't need to approach the optimal to take down those contests on big slates, but especially so in smaller fields. So I think that's the right approach. I think there's nothing wrong with that. And again, I think if we were looking at just even what the builder is probably going to lead you down for something like a small field contest, say we were maybe playing, let's like say like a 3 max, about 1,000 people or so. I think the builder is going to emphasize those kinds of stacks for you anyway. Let's see what we get out of this. But you're thinking through it in the right way, right? Smaller field, bigger slate, less likely that the winning lineup hits the optimal, more likely that we want to use big stacks and emphasize those in our lineup. So yeah, you can see it right here, right? Little 3-man, 1,000 people contest, right? 5-3, 5-2, big correlated stacks emphasized in our builds. So definitely the right approach. Steve said, my personal opinion is SaberSim does most of the heavy lifting. It gives you everything. I don't use anything else. All the data I have, I use. Yeah, that's great. And that's awesome. And again, the point of the correlation slider is that you should never have to use the stacking rule, right? The lineups have win equity for the contest you're building for anyway. The best usage of a stacking rule is that if you are going to go in the post-build process and eliminate a certain set of lineups that don't fit a certain stacking rule to begin with, the whole reason the stacking rule is there is so that you can just build the pool of lineups that better matches what you're trying to do from the start. That's all it really is. On certain slates, I know I'm going to play 5 stacks when it's big 10 plus game slates, things like that. I might want to play 5 stacks. On smaller slates, lower than 10 games, I know I'm still probably going to want 4 stacks. Again, depends a little bit on the slate, but I know that there's certain stacking types that I'm just going to eliminate if they show up at all in the post-build process. So I set a stacking rule for it. But it's not there as like this, you must be using this thing to be successful, right? You don't have to, because the correlation slider is taking care of 90% of that for you. So, but anyway, good questions. Always interested to talk a little bit about stacking here. Cool. So I think I've covered a lot of the questions here I got in beforehand. So I'm going to go ahead and just get caught up on some of these questions that trickled in here on YouTube. So we did get a question here from Terry. Does SaberSim factor in weather? Yes, it does. It takes into account the temperature, takes into account wind direction, takes into account precipitation chance, or at least or humidity, I think. Everything that kind of would go into affecting the game simulations is taken into account. So you will see some sims run every once in a while too in the Slack channel that say the roof status has changed. Obviously, when the roof it was expected to be open and is then going to be closed, or vice versa, has a pretty dramatic effect on the run totals. That actually can often create some pretty different sims after that's been taken into account. So yes, we are taking into account the weather of the games and where they are being played. So I saw James said, yes, they do, Terry. Yep, you got it. So, but looks like Terry took something down here, $100 in a quarter takedown. Congratulations. That's fantastic. That is an awesome ROI. What is that? 400% as a ROI takedown there. So pretty awesome. Jim said, not having any success building anything. I'm only a single entry player. I don't have time or patience for 150. Yeah, honestly, Jim, I'll tell you what, it is going to be tough. It takes a long time to realize the edge that you have if you're playing a single lineup or even a few lineups in single entries every night, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Those are often the best structured contests on the sites. Those are very strong contests to play, but it takes a long time to realize that edge, right? I actually did a video. I don't know if you caught it. It is now posted as a greatest hits here. Or it should be at least. It must be in here. This isn't sorted the right way. Let's see. Sort, date added, newest. Yeah, this one. So I actually posted this video last week here. This was an office hours question that came in. But what I did here, definitely recommend checking this out if you haven't watched it. But I assumed for a 150 maxer, what 100 slates might look like if this player was profitable. And what we found is that there's a lot of 100 slate samples that you can kind of simulate or pull out. Here, this is kind of weird seeing my face twice, so I'm going to put that away. But where you still end up negative or break even, right? Or you don't have a very good 100 slate sample just because there's so much variance, even for a player that's profitable. And that was with the assumption of 150 lineups every single night. So that edge can take even longer to realize sometimes if you are playing single entries, which again is totally fine. Those are very strong contests to play. But just make sure you're using strong bankroll management and you're staying with it and you're using a process that makes sense, because it takes a long time to realize that. So it is tricky. Let's see. I'm going to keep rolling here. James said took down a League of Legends contest over the weekend, and I know nothing about it. Made $100. That is awesome as well. Again, I mentioned it here before. A lot of these principles between sports are the same, right? What are the primary principles behind League of Legends, right? We want to correlate our lineups by stacking. We want to take advantage of ownership by finding when the field is underrating a team's chance to win, for example. And we want to build and use players in our leverage spots, like our captain position, that have high upside, right? Those are the concepts that we talked about in our esports strategy session. Now that was 6 or so weeks ago. Those concepts should not really sound unfamiliar to anybody that's been watching office hours. And they are concepts that are applicable in a lot of DFS sports. So congratulations, James. You're in here every single day watching our show. So it doesn't surprise me that you've been having some success and translating that success to other sports. But yeah, so Jim said here, I think I'm going to max out smart diversity every time. Pitcher variance is getting crazy now. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that with smart diversity, to be completely honest. You're using single game simulations, right? You are really going to allow a lot of variance into your builds, but the slate is only going to pay out one single time. And I've been experimenting with some very high smart diversity sliders this season as well. And I don't think it's something that you're not going to break the build, right? You can't even at single game simulations, all you're essentially doing is pulling out game sims that mimic what's actually going to take place, right? They're not going to play every game 10 times and then take the average scores of 10, right? They're using single game simulations. You are going to lower your average expectation, right? Your win equity of your min cash positions is probably going to go down, and it is probably going to make your swings a little bit more extreme. If seeing a min cash or a triple up cat or a triple cash or something like that on your contest at the end of the night is something that's important to you, you are going to lower the equity of those positions in the contest the higher your smart diversity slider goes. So if that is something that is important to you, I would first make sure you're not investing too much bankroll, because that's kind of a false goal. That's not something we're actually shooting for. But if it is, I would be careful with maybe bumping up that smart diversity slider, because you are probably going to increase your variance and lower your average min cash type equity, right? But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I've been enjoying doing that recently. But Jim said, I play a different lineup for every single entry contest. Is that the optimal approach? I think if you're playing, like, yeah, if you're playing, I mean, even up to, I don't even know, 10 or 20 different single entries, I would still be playing a different lineup here in every contest. Again, just trying to smooth out that variance as much as possible. On any given 10 game slate like we have tonight, there are absolutely 10 or 20 different single entry lineups that are that are viable for the contest. So I would definitely recommend playing different lineups in every contest here. If you are mostly playing single entries, because there are plenty of lineups to play. There are plenty of lineups that have win equity for those contests, and that will lower your swings a little bit, right? Even if you're playing like 5 contests, you don't need to take down all 5 the same night. Take down 1, get yourself a little bit of a return on investment, realize some of that edge, and live to play another day the next night. So, but Jim said, thanks. Yeah, man, you got it. Cool. What else do we have here? Just catching up. I'm looking at chats here. James said, every time in my lineup build, there's almost always a lineup that has been built that would win the #1 spot. So SaberSim is really helpful. That's great. And again, we talked about this a little bit last week too, but kind of thinking about, even if you only enter 3 contests in a 3 max or something like that, well, it's better thought of for 150 max, right? But say you're playing 150 and you have lineups in your big pool of 1,500 that would have performed in the top 1% or the top 0.1%, right? That is a bit of an achievement in itself, and that is an indication that your process is probably working, especially if you're outpacing your top 1% expectation, right? If you're putting 3% of your total pool of 1,500 lineups in the top 1% in the contest, that's probably just a variance game before that hits in favor of you, right? And when we think about how many lineups that are actually even buildable for a contest or even make sense, right? Even the number of lineups that are within $500 of the salary cap, implying that it's probably a pretty good lineup. There is so many different lineups you can build, hundreds of thousands of lineups you can build. So if you're building 1,500, even if you're pulling 150 out of that and entering those, which we are, if your pool of 1,500 is outperforming its top 1% expectation, it probably means you're doing something right. So Jim said, can you go over that review process one time? There was one thing I didn't understand. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the idea here, let's do it for a 20 max, right? It's a little more simple. So let's say you're playing 20 max contests every night. You're playing something like the quarter jukebox. And let's say this was your build, and we'll let this run here real quick. And the idea here is to compare of the pool of lineups that you actually built, right? Oh, so it's only going to build 200. That's fine. Okay. What is a reasonable expectation of how many of these lineups would be in the top 1% of a contest, right? It's probably 2. 2% in theory, if this was a totally average set of lineups, 2 of these lineups would make it in the top 1% of the contest, right? And every player that goes in and comparatively 0.2 lineups of your actual 20 that you're going to play are going to make it in the top 1%, right? If you are above average player, if you are playing better than the rest of the field, you would expect that there would be a greater percentage of these lineups that make it in the top 1%. So if you had 4 lineups of your 200 that were in the top 1%, you would be twice as good as an average player in theory for this particular contest. You would have 2 times as many lineups in the top 1%. And this can be a way Again, over a single slate sample, this is way too small of a sample size to do anything with. But over a long sample size, over like a month of slates, if you're finding that you are putting lineups, if your pool of 200 lineups is outperforming its top 1% expectation, the lineups that actually end up in the contest, the 20 you put in, is kind of just a variance game, kind of a bit of a waiting game before your time has come to realize your edge, right? And to finally have that bank. So that's kind of the idea of, you can do this. This is in advance. This is for like tonight's slate, but you could go back to past slates and actually see how your lineups performed in the contest, provided that you have that information. So like if you went here and you went to this build and say these were the lineups that you actually ran for the contest, you could go in and look and say, well, let's let this load for a second here. Let's see. I want to see what sliders we used for this. Okay. So this actually was a research build, 8-0-10, but that's fine for the purposes of this. So you can actually go in and sort by actual score and then look at your contest, and maybe the top 1% lineup would be 0.01 times the number of entries in the contest. So say for the mini max or something like that, it would be the 500th best lineup, and say the 500th best lineup scored 155 or something like that, right? And then we can go look and how many lineups were in our pool sorted by actual score that scored over 155. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lineups, right? So we would have expected that we would have 15 lineups in this pool that scored over it. And in this case, there were only 7. That means we underperformed our expectation. But if the top score was 148, we have 20 lineups. That's over 1% of 1,500, and we would have overperformed our expectation, right? Because a perfectly average player is going to have 1% of their total lineup show up in the top 1%. Now, in reality, what's actually really going to happen here is these are going to be kind of correlated, right? Because when we are right, a lot of our lineups are going to be right most of the time, depending on how spread out you play. It's not, I wouldn't say what's actually going to happen is you're going to realize that every single day of the week, you had 3% of your lineups or something like that. 2% or 3% of your lineups were in the top 1% of the contest. What's actually more likely to happen, because your lineups are going to be, well, this again is a research build, so it's max smart diversity, right? But say that Atlanta and Tampa Bay were the right plays on the slate for this past Friday night or whatever it was, you're going to put an enormous amount of your lineups in the top 1%. And that's why I say, to kind of smooth out the variance of looking at this at one slate, it makes more sense to track this over time, over a lot of different slates. Because in reality, or if we jump back to today and we look at our 20 max, right? Oh, I see some questions are coming in that I missed here a little bit. Jim said, if I use custom projections, you mean just go back to those and run lineups after the game? You don't even have to. You can use the actual build you used before. You can just go back to the actual build. You don't need to rebuild necessarily. You can just go to the actual build that ended up filling in your sliders. So Jim also said, when do you click that review button? What the review button is going to do, it's called review mode, is it's going to do the same thing as sorting by actual score, but it's going to restrict it to the actual lineups that you've selected for your contest. So let me show you what I mean. So if you go back here, right, actual score is going to filter the entire big pool of 1,500 by the actual score that those players scored in their lineups. Review mode is going to lock in the 150 sorted by Saber score or projected score, and then sort it by actual score. So like, this is more useful if you want to look at your entire pool of 1,500. But if you only want to look at the actual lineups you played, you can go back, sort this by whatever you sorted, Saber score, for example, and then toggle review mode on. And it's just going to sort the 150 here So if we had played this 150 set of lineups, our best scoring lineup would have actually been the 10th lineup sorted by Saber score, and it would have scored 153 points. The next best lineup was the 14th lineup, and it would have scored 150.7, right? Of the entire pool, the best scoring lineup was the... Oh, it won't show you that way. But it was an 85th. It was an 85.1 overall Saber score, and it scored 188. So Stuart said, "Hey, Jordan, thanks for the feedback. I am Schmeiler." Awesome. Welcome. Glad you made it here today. Hopefully my answers or discussions at the start of the show here on your questions were helpful, but I'm glad you're here. I know you had some questions about NFL Showdown too, so we'll be getting to some NFL content here pretty soon. Again, I just want to make sure that the projections are dialed in, and we're feeling good about where the sims are at for NFL before we start running test builds and getting anything a little strange or anything showing up like that. So, but Jim, let me know if that kind of helped. I don't use review mode that much, to be completely honest, because isolating your 150 lineups and looking at those is something that you almost can just do in the DraftKings or FanDuel app. Like most of the time at the end of the night, the slate's wrapping up. I'll just kind of look at the lineups I entered in the app and kind of quickly see like what lineups did well, what stacks did well, what didn't. I think that's easier, but I do like to go back and look at the entire pool sorted by actual score, because it can be kind of interesting to just know, like, did I actually have a pretty good view on the slate? Was my entire pool of lineups kind of well tuned in to what I wanted to do, and I just got hit with bad variance, or was it just a night that I wasn't meant to be, right? So I like to use actual score and look at the full pool a little bit more, but let me know if that helps. I don't know. This is the kind of the question I was trying to answer here of going back through the review process. So you said there was one thing you didn't understand. If I still haven't covered that, just let me know, but all right, cool. Question came in from Tone here in Slack. Let me go ahead and chat about this a little bit. Take a look. He said, "I read somewhere that basing builds off of ceiling projections can be a viable strategy. The article mentioned that the average actual scores of these builds is virtually the same as the median projected lineups, but just that the higher percentage lineups virtually the same as median projected builds, but that the higher percentage lineups and builds using ceiling projections were on average 7 points better. Do you think this would be a viable strategy using SS, like maybe using the 25 percentile projections to do builds?" And then Tone said, "I love the smart..." So I assume this was coming in when we were talking about smart diversity earlier. "I love the smart diversity. When reviewing past slates, I noticed that more smart diversity used, the higher upside lineups generated into the pool." So that is probably just true, right? And that makes sense. The smaller the buckets of sims we use, the greater those crazy outlier performances are going to be able to show up in the builds, and those are the builds that those are the lineups that end up being in the top 1% of contests, right? Our tooltip actually says basically exactly that much when you hover over smart diversity, right? Diversify your possible outcome, or diversify your lineups at the expense of average performance, right? The average projected scores are going to go down, but the upside of those lineups is going to shoot way up. So I wouldn't do this, though. I wouldn't use the 25th percentile projections. I think if you want to, you can go ahead and set these projections here. Let's go back here. We're not on today. I think you can go ahead and set the percentiles at something like 85th or even 95th and emphasize a little bit more ceiling outcomes in your lineups, right? This is going to shift our mean projection of every player to their 85th percentile outcome. Basically trying to say I'm going to build lineups optimized to every player hitting their ceiling outcome, right? I'm going to make their 85th percentile outcome their 50th percentile outcome, their average projection, and then run builds. It's not going to do a dramatic change to your lineups overall. I would say in general, kind of the spirit behind this question basing builds off of ceiling projections, smart diversity is kind of a better alternative to doing that anyway, right? When you're seeing a ceiling projection on a lot of other sites that just use basically a basic raw projection tool, all they're doing is they're assuming a player has a normal distribution, which of course most players don't. This is not a normal distribution, but they're assuming a player has a normal distribution. They're applying probably some historical standard deviation to that player's projection and then assigning their ceiling value as probably 2 standard deviations away from the mean, right? And that is an attempt to quantify upside, but it is what's the right word? It is resting on a faulty assumption that all players are normally distributed, and it is ultimately just going to build the exact same lineups as it would when you're using an average projection, right? Nothing's actually going to change. With smart diversity, and at smart diversity at really high values, we bucket the sims randomly, and we'll take higher values. We'll take smaller random buckets of game simulations to determine each player's projection, which is going to naturally incorporate real upsides and ceilings and floors into your lineups when we build every single lineup for your pool, right? So you're already going to emphasize ceiling values because when we bucket the game simulations, or when you use smart diversity at 10, for example, when you get the game simulation where Baltimore scores 12 runs, right, you're going to get a Baltimore stack because the players all had those 85th, 95th percentile outcomes to get that team to their 85th or 95th percentile outcome, right? We don't need to set even with percentiles, you get this impact a little bit, right? It doesn't really make so much sense to necessarily set every player or team to their 95th percentile outcome because that's not what's going to happen. And even if it did, that doesn't really help us, right? What we want is we want to isolate the individual unique ranges of outcomes that all can kind of come together on the slate by using smart diversity, right? So, like overall here, again, I think a lot of times these questions come in, and there's something in here, whether we were talking about ownership sum earlier or optimizing based on ceiling projections, right? They are just indications of just how poorly traditional optimizers are equipped to deal with the problem of how to play DFS for GPPs today, right? Traditional optimizers using average projections and solving the knapsack problem of trying to fit as many average projections under a certain salary cap don't deal with the problem of how to win a GPP very well. And generating ceiling projections with an assumption that every player is normally distributed is an attempt to solve that problem that just doesn't do it very well. Smart diversity and using game simulations does. So I think if you want to, long story short here, coming full circle, if you really want to emphasize upside into your lineups, crank smart diversity up. And I think from there, if you're already using a really high smart diversity for your builds, and you want to maybe even emphasize upside or ceiling a little bit more, then I think you can experiment with using some of these percentiles to try to emphasize some players that maybe have a little bit of a higher 95th percentile outcome than their average projection would indicate and things like that. But smart diversity, again, is doing 90% of the work for you here. And yeah, it makes sense. Again, I guess coming back to this point too here, it makes sense that those lineups that are, those builds that are running much higher smart diversity have greater upside lineups in your pool. I think that makes sense. I would probably say that while that is true, if you took the average actual score of every single lineup in your pool, it would probably be lower over a long period of time, the higher your smart diversity is. So again, min caching doesn't matter in GPPs. We do not care about that. But I see it every day in Slack that there are people that will say, I haven't even cached once all week, right? That doesn't, if you min cache all week, it doesn't matter either, right? The goal is to win. But I know that is important to people, and I know that average performance is some. I think it's a false indicator, but is an indicator to people. So if you crank up smart diversity and your lineups are min caching less, again, I would say that's fine. Don't even worry about it. But it will have that impact. So. So real quick, I'm going to jump to this because I saw this question come in and I want to address it. So Jim said, the single entry build that I mainly play a smart diversity at 3, do I want to go all the way at 10 or something in the 5 to 6 range? All I need, say 2,000 entries, single entry. Let me see. Let's get this back to normal. Okay. So something like this. Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting, right? Like what the sliders are telling us is that historically, when we build builds at different settings, that the highest expected value when we build thousands of lineups is a smart diversity of 3, right? This is a single entry contest. These are kind of small fields. There aren't going to be there's not going to be a lot of diversification over the entire field of lineups. There are probably going to be stacks that are even barely used. The ownership is going to condense very heavily on the teams that are going to be the chalkiest anyway. We don't need to do that much to get different and to find upside in these contests. That being said, if you want to emphasize ceiling more at the expense of average performance, Jim, I would explore cranking this up a bit. And seeing what you think about those lineups there. I would even say you could try running some builds at 10 and just experiment and just see what kinds of lineups are coming out and see if you like kind of how they look. There's going to be quite a bit more diversification that's showing up here too than maybe what you are used to. If you're building with the typical smart diversity at 3 and say you're building 5 or so lineups to pick out and play in the 5 single entries, I've typically found that it's going to kind of give you a certain way to target the slate. Maybe it's going to give you 2 core pitchers and a core stack, and each lineup is going to rotate the other minor stack around that, right? And it's going to give you a very kind of core plays approach of how you're tackling the slate. Cranking smart diversity up is going to diversify that quite a bit. You can see here, smart diversity at 10 for a lineup like this, right? It's much more diverse, even if we just come down to 5, right? There's just a lot more, there's some more diversity in the stacks here. The pitchers are going to be quite more diverse. And I think you're going to find that in a single entry in particular, that, again, ownership is going to condense pretty heavily. And some of these like next best up plays, guys like Wade Miley and things like that, are probably going to come in quite a bit lower owned than we would predict. So I would, if you're playing single entries, I would experiment with turning smart diversity up and see what you think about the lineups and see what you think about the exposures and how spread out versus how condensed you want to be. This isn't the kind of thing that is like bink button, right? I would say for anyone watching this, if you've been kind of just putting together your MLB process, turning smart diversity up to 10 is not like the missing piece that's all going to kind of bring it together. It is just a way to get a wider player pool and get a wider player pool while emphasizing upside in your lineups at the expense of average performance. I use high smart diversity sliders mostly because I'm playing 150 max contests. I want to emphasize upside, and I like the idea of knowing that my projections were built with single game simulations. But again, the default sliders would imply that we don't need to find that much upside at all comparatively in a contest of this size. That smart diversity at 3 is plenty. And that kind of gives us enough of our upside. So I don't think there's anything wrong with experimenting with higher values. I think you should just realize what it is doing and why, and what impact it's going to have on your lineups. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. And again, we're talking a lot about sliders today, and I'm always a little bit cautious on these shows where we talk a lot about sliders, because that is not a point of emphasis that I don't want to emphasize on the show, that dialing in sliders is a part of a should be a significant part of anyone's process, right? The sliders should pretty much just be like, okay, the sliders are set. I'm using defaults, or I'm slightly changing them, and I'm just going. And I'm adding my value on projections, or I'm adding my value on exposures, or I'm adding my value elsewhere in the process, right? So I'm always a little bit careful. I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about where to dial in sliders, because it is a really kind of a low value add part of the process, right? The defaults are very good. There are opportunities to move things around. And from there, add your value, editing projections, editing ownership projections, editing exposures, finding your leverage, that kind of thing. So, Jim said, I use the bat and upload to SaberSim. What are your thoughts? We stand behind our projections. We think that we've got the best projections that are out there, but I know we have plenty of users that are uploading their own projections that are combinations of some other sources, or maybe their own custom projections or whatever. Again, the nice thing about doing that is that you are still using our game simulations. You're still taking advantage of our real ranges of outcomes. And when you upload custom projections, all we are doing is shifting the mean of those projections to match your customs. So you're still taking advantage and still getting to use players' real ranges of outcomes in your process. Again, we think that we've got the strongest set of projections that are out there available. We stand behind them, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with having another source of at least a counterpoint or another way of looking at things, or maybe an opportunity to see a team that's going under-owned on a different model or something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, but similarly, though, and like in a similar vein, I don't think there's a set of projections out there or a projection model that is the missing piece, right? Projections represent a range of outcomes. So when you're thinking about that, right, we're using custom projections one way or another is going to shift a range of outcomes in one direction or the other. But just like the optimal sliders are not the missing piece that's kind of been missing from your process this entire time, neither are the projections, right? As long as you're using a decently good set of projections, which again, the default of SaberSims are probably a very good set of projections. The missing piece where the bink button is going to kind of magically show up is not some random set of projections that's out there that's winning all the money. It doesn't really work like that. So, but cool. I see a little bit of back and forth here in YouTube. Looks like the hour's kind of gone pretty fast on us here. We've had some good conversations here today. Oh, I missed one. I saw Stuart asked another follow-up here. So would a 10x, 40x basically be like a smaller field GPP and set sliders and field size accordingly? I play mostly GPPs and 10x are among my best ROI. Yeah, I would basically play it like that. So if you were playing 10x's, like they're normally pretty small field. I think they're like something like this. And I think most of the time they're like somewhere between 3 max and 20 max. I would probably be approaching it something like this, right? This is going to emphasize stacks, which I think is crucial for 10x's, but there's not enough people in the contest that you really need to feel like you need to have aggressive ownership stands, right? Leak a little bit of upside into your build and a little bit of diversity with smart diversity. And I think you're good to go with these kinds of things. That's how I would approach 10x's and 40x's, right? They are basically GPPs in terms of how much of the field is getting paid out. But instead of having a staircase payout structure of who's getting paid out, it's just completely flat from 1 through whatever the payout positions are. So it makes a lot of sense from my perspective to play it like a GPP. But yeah, great question. All right, guys, cool. Yeah, no, it's been another awesome show here today. We talked a little bit. We talked about some of these booster contests, some of these multiplier contests, some small field stuff. We talked about editing team totals and ways to use that as a way to get leverage or as a way to, I guess, incorporating editing team projections without feeling like you're trying to be hyper accurate, instead using it as a bit of a tool for your lineups, but also some ways to add value to your process differently in a different way. We talked a little bit about stacking, especially on FanDuel, optimal stack sizing, using the manual stacking rule or not. We talked a lot about review mode, a little bit more about kind of reviewing your past lineups for top 1% equity here. I think that is kind of just about covers it, but it's been another great show. Thanks, everybody that was here watching me here today. We'll be right back at it again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you've got questions as you're building lineups for tonight's slate, let me know. Pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or email us, support@sabersim.com. We'll cover them on tomorrow's show. Look forward to later this week. I believe we are going to be doing a preview of the redesign. So I've been teasing that here for a bit now, the last couple weeks, but I think either later this week, maybe even Wednesday or Thursday, we're hoping to do a strategy session here this week. Won't be so much of a strategy session, I guess, but a redesign sneak preview. We've got a visual update that is getting kind of close. We've started a beta here for that in the final 2 weeks or so, like recently, but there's a bunch of new features that we'll be shipping with that. I've been teasing a lot of those on the show these past couple weeks, so look forward to that later this week. Anyway, I'll let you guys go. Been enough of me talking, so I'll see you guys tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy the slate tonight, and see you later.